Well, if you're like me, you've seen the headlines over the past couple of days. The United States is now at war with Iran. Iran is going to close the Strait of Hormuz. And when they do, it's going to spell financial catastrophe for the entire globe. 20% of global oil trade will be disrupted. And that is going to cause record high oil prices, perhaps as high as $200 per barrel. That's not just going to make gas prices higher at the tank, it's going to raise the price of literally everything. And on top of that, it is going to fuel Russia's war against Ukraine. It is going to rescue the Russian economy. It's going to save them from imminent disaster. And maybe all of this together will actually lead to World War III. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, on top of that, Paul Warburg is even filming a video indoors instead of hiking to the mountains to find some scenic backdrop. The world is coming to an end. Is Paul hiding from Iranian missiles? What's going on? Well, in reality, I'm just filming indoors because I hurt my back. It's a little bit tweaked, but it's going to recover in a couple of days, and we're going to get back to normal. And as you'll see, that is also much the same as the potential oil crisis that everybody is worried about around the Iran war and around the Strait of Hormuz. Because there are a lot of economic principles that the headlines simply aren't capturing when they are portraying the fear of the worst-case scenario that could theoretically happen as a result of this war, but that almost certainly will not happen. And that's what I wanted to make this video to explain. Now let's start this discussion by acknowledging something. When we look at recent history, there are a lot of very real historical precedents for global oil price shocks, for reasons that were very similar to what we're now seeing in Iran today. And because of that, these are the examples that a lot of people think of when they're trying to understand what might actually happen as a result of this particular war. Some people might think back as recently as 2008, when oil prices hit $147 per barrel, or they might think most often back to the 1970s, when there were actually multiple different oil price shocks, and people think back to those historical images of big long queues at the gas stations as there were just shortages and people were trying to get a hold of gasoline before it ran out. A lot of people think that that might happen again today as a result of what's happening in Iran, but the truth is that the world has become a fundamentally different place as a result of all of these different oil price shocks. And actually, since these things have happened, the solution to these things has been put in place in each instance. And in response to the oil crises in the 1970s, the global oil system put a lot of checks and balances in place to keep it secure, even under pressure. And the same thing happened back around 2008. And those are the things I want to talk about in this video to show you how relatively secure global energy supplies actually are. Now, when I say that oil prices are relatively secure, I'm not arguing that oil prices are invulnerable or invincible, or that there can't be a large variance in oil prices. And in fact, in reality, we can see large spikes in oil prices that make things a lot more expensive than they are today. But when I say that oil prices are relatively secure, as you'll see in today's video, what I mean is that there is an upper limit to how bad things can actually get, and that upper limit is far lower than a lot of people are speculating as they think about the worst case scenario if Iran does indeed close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz obviously is very pivotal to global oil trade. 20% of global trade goes through there on a daily basis, and something like a third of all maritime global oil trade goes through there. So it's a big deal when the strait is closed down because the world is actually cut off from a huge supply of energy. And they're not just cut off from a huge supply of energy, they're actually cut off from the supply of energy that is the cheapest to produce. And so the fears of oil prices going through the roof, they're not completely misplaced. But it turns out that there are mechanisms that keep the entire planet a lot safer than most people realize that I don't see being talked about in the news today. Because the news seems to be making all of their money and gathering all of their attention by hyping worst case scenarios. So what am I talking about? Well, there's a couple different mechanisms that I want to explain in detail. The first is how we can actually bypass the Strait of Hormuz for a good chunk of the oil that typically goes through there, eliminating a good chunk of the problem just from the forefront. But the second also has to do with global oil reserves that keep the world rather stable for a longer period of time than a lot of people seem to realize. And the third is that even if these oil reserves are completely tapped out, the market dynamics actually end up activating other oil fields that currently aren't in production today that keeps the world from having supply shocks, even if global oil prices do go up by a significant amount. So the approach I'll take today is to start from the point of catastrophe, the Strait of Hormuz, and I'll sort of zoom out from there to show how the world can respond at each level of the crisis. And what you'll see is that at each level that we zoom out, you realize that the crisis gets less and less and less concerning because it shrinks in size and the response grows. But we should start at the Strait of Hormuz to actually define what a worst-case crisis would actually look like, which almost certainly is not the world losing the entire supply of oil that typically traverses that strait. First and foremost, we should mention that the Strait of Hormuz itself being fully blocked is extremely unlikely, especially under the specific circumstances that we're seeing today. To completely block the Strait of Hormuz, what Iran would have to do is they would actually have to lay naval mines across the entire strait. And currently, they just don't have the naval resources to do that. The United States has been actively sinking the Iranian Navy, and they're active around the area around Hormuz, so that if Iran tried to do this, the United States would basically ensure that they would only be partially effective. That's not to say it's the only thing that Iran can do to close the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, they have effectively closed it, but only temporarily, because what they're doing is they're threatening to basically sink any ship that traverses the strait. And this is causing ships to pause outside of the strait to kind of wait and see what happens. A lot of ships may be doing this because they're afraid of being sunk, but I think actually most ships are doing this because the situation will be more ideal with every day they wait. It doesn't mean they're never going to start going through the strait again. It doesn't mean they're going to wait months to go through the strait. It means that every day that the war goes on, more Iranian missiles are being taken offline, and Iran's actual ability to sink ships that traverse the strait goes down. The big reason ships aren't traversing the strait isn't isn't just because of the threat of the Iranian missiles, but also because of whether or not their insurance company will cover them and the rate that they have to pay for the insurance company to cover them. And all of these dynamics, again, they just make it more worthwhile for ships to wait. And so in a worst case scenario, we will see some traffic start to trickle through the Strait of Hormuz again, and maybe even some of this traffic would be sunk by Iran. But even that would only be a portion of all the traffic, certainly not all of it, probably not even a majority of it. So let's keep that in the back of our minds from the forefront, because what it shows us is that a worst case scenario is probably still only going to be about half as bad as what's being projected. And that's probably even being generous. At most, Iran will probably be able to stop half of the traffic from going through the Strait of Hormuz over the long term, and again, that's generous. But let's analyze the situation going forward as if Iran were completely effective, as if the Strait of Hormuz just simply didn't exist anymore, because that will help us realize how even under a much worse scenario than the world is likely to actually experience, the world actually remains a lot more stable than projected. So a big consideration here is that the Strait of Hormuz is not the only way to transport oil out of the Persian Gulf. It's simply the only way to do that through maritime traffic. And in producing headlines about the Strait of Hormuz, people always talk about how it is responsible for 20% of global oil trade. But that's actually not really accurate. It's simply the most convenient way to transport the oil that accounts for 20% of the global oil trade. But there are other routes that are designed specifically for emergencies like this. Because you have to remember that the Gulf countries, the countries that surround the Persian Gulf, they're basically totally dependent on oil exports to keep their economies and their countries alive. And they are not just going to sit around with the threat of Iran being able to close off the Strait of Hormuz, which has existed for decades, without protecting themselves. And they have protected themselves. And the way they protected themselves is with bypass pipelines. Now, these aren't an effective long-term solution. They only account for a portion of the trade, and they're also not as efficient or as affordable as, for example, the maritime traffic. But they're also not nothing. And currently, the bypass pipelines that go through Saudi Arabia, and also through the UAE, these account for about a third of the oil capacity that the Strait of Hormuz typically handles. So we're talking around 6.5 million barrels per day that can be transported through pipelines that completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz right off the top. So that means that even if the oil trade from the Strait of Hormuz was completely cut off, well, in reality, that problem would be 1/3 smaller than most people are anticipating. And if the Strait of Hormuz is only halfway cut off, well, if half the traffic is going through the strait, and if these oil pipelines are operating at maximum capacity, you actually have 80% of the oil supplies protected, not the worst case scenario that everybody's projecting. So with just those factors in mind, we see that the potential scope of the problem of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz is only about 1/5 as bad as most people have been projecting. About 4% of global oil supply instead of 20%. And that is not nearly the same problem, but it is still a big potential problem if viewed on its own. But as you'll see as we zoom further out, even this 4% doesn't exist in isolation. Again, people think back to the crises that happened back in the 70s, where I think around that time, this isn't precise, but I think it was 8 or 9% of global oil supplies that went offline and caused a huge catastrophe. Now that's a problem, 4% is still smaller than that, but even then, people don't realize that the world has reconfigured itself since those catastrophes of the 1970s because they actually learned their lesson. And the big response to this has been global oil reserves, where most countries, because of exactly what happened in the past, have now built up strategic oil reserves that can last them for quite a long time. In particular, if you are a country who is a member of the IEA, which accounts for like the United States, Canada, most major European countries, you are actually required to have reserves that are 90 days of your net imports. And that means that for most of the major economies who are actually consumers of oil, they have reserves, which means that if they didn't get another drop of oil for 90 days, another drop imported for 90 days, I should say, they would be just fine. They wouldn't run out. Now, having reserves equal to 90 days of net imports, that is a lot on its own. But it turns out that that actually lasts a lot longer than it even sounds. Because again, these are 90 days of reserves of all net imports. They will last you a lot longer if you don't lose all of your imports, but you only lose a portion of those imports. And if we just look at the global macro scale, I know some countries are more affected than others, but if we just look at the global macro scale, in this case, the worst case scenario we're looking at is like 20% of imports being lost if the Strait of Hormuz is completely closed, and more like 4% in a more realistic scenario. I don't feel like doing the precise math here off the top of my head, but if you're actually losing 4% of your imports instead of 100%, that 90 days of reserves will last you 25 times longer. 90 times 25 is a number that is bigger than 1800. 1800 days is around 5 years. So countries that are importing oil actually have reserves that in the most realistic scenario that could actually happen with the war in Iran right now, they could last them for 5 years on their own if that's how long the war continued and if the Strait of Hormuz was partially closed for that entire period of time. That is a really long time, and there's other factors here as well, because it's not just having 90 days of reserves, it's also the fact that these countries that are part of this agreement, they also have to have plans in place to reduce demand, which will make the reserves last even longer. And there's also the fact that a lot of these people who import energy, they intentionally import a portion of their energy that they have the capability to produce on their own soil so that they can turn to their own production in times of emergency to make things last a little bit longer. There's a lot of other escape valves. So basically, before the war in Iran can actually result in a global financial catastrophe, at least in real terms, people might overreact and that might cause problems on its own. But before the war in Iran can create a global financial catastrophe, in real terms, these reserves have to first be largely exhausted, because only then, in real terms, will the world be reeling from real oil supply shock. Now, this can be accelerated. I guess in theory, Iran could strike some of the pipelines that bypass the Strait of Hormuz, and that can make reserves dwindle quicker, but the reserves will still be there, and they'll still last longer than 90 days. So there is a lot of cushion before this becomes a real problem. And there might be some changes in the price of oil to make things last even longer, or because people know that there's fears and so they know that they can get away with charging a higher price, or because countries aren't willing to release their reserves and they would rather contend with a higher price for a time rather than getting rid of their strategic nest egg there. There's all these other considerations. But in the long term, the reserves are what actually matters in terms of the world kind of spiraling out of control. But even more than these actual kind of governmental controls and these bypasses to the Strait of Hormuz, there is another set of dynamics here that makes things even more secure on top of that. And this is arguably the most important set of dynamics that again sets a very hard limit on how high oil prices can actually go for the long term. So the other set of dynamics that seems to get forgotten a lot here is market dynamics, supply and demand. And arguably, this is the most important set of dynamics because it's the most dependable. Because while you can never depend on what a government might do or what might happen to an oil pipeline in a specific region of the world, there's one thing that you can always depend on. When there's profits to be made, companies are going to enter the picture, and there's always going to be competition, and real competition will keep prices within a certain range. And what's often forgotten when it comes to the oil industry is that not all oil production is made equal, especially when it comes to the price of production. In particular, some oil fields, like those around the Persian Gulf, are very cheap to produce on. Other oil fields, like the ones in the United States, are a lot more expensive to produce on. And what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz potentially being closed is that some of the world's most affordable oil fields are the ones that are not going to be able to sell as much supply just because of logistics constraints. But as that drives oil prices up, that actually makes other oil fields that currently are not being produced on, it makes them viable for production. So these numbers, again, they're not precise, they're directionally correct. I think in the Persian Gulf, it's something like $15 to $20 per barrel to actually produce a barrel. So you need to sell it for $21 to make a profit if you produce it for $20. In the United States, there's different price ranges, but for the oil fields that aren't currently being produced on, the dynamics are more like you need $70 to $90 per barrel to turn a profit, because most of these are shale oil fields where it's much more expensive. You have to drill through rock, the equipment's more expensive, all of that sort of stuff. That being said, the supply levels are extremely high. So there is a lot of oil beneath the ground, and the shale oil, but there's also, deep sea oil. You think of oil rigs, that's also a big supply source that's more expensive. And there's also oil sands, which has a lot of oil, which is more expensive. There's a lot of oil supply that is not being produced except for in, very small quantities that would be ramped up if global oil prices started going up. So if you get global oil prices that go above $100, all of a sudden, shale oil in the United States is extremely profitable. People start producing it more, and this kind of overcomes the supply problem of the Strait of Hormuz being shut down. Now, you still have a higher oil price. It might be quite a bit higher, and maybe the companies producing the oil aren't making as much profit. Consumers are paying a little bit more, but there's an upper limit. Because when you can, at the most expensive, produce a barrel of oil, and the oil sands, I think it's like $100 a barrel. That's the most expensive it can get to produce a barrel of oil, and there's plenty of supplies. If oil costs start getting above $100 or $150 for too long, people will enter, they'll supply more, and that will bring prices down. Now, there will still be a period while people are getting production online where oil prices might be higher than that. You might hit $150 for a time because it takes time to get new oil fields online and things like that. But for the long term, the effective maximum oil price is somewhere just a little bit above those production costs. And again, it's higher than we're paying today, but it's not the $200 number that I keep hearing thrown around. Like, people are just pulling this number out of nowhere. I don't actually know where it's coming from. This still, though, isn't the full story, and it turns out that the global energy supply is even more secure than this. Because so far, all we've looked at is the supply side and what happens to global energy supplies if the Strait of Hormuz is indeed cut off. But we haven't yet looked at the demand side. and the fact that when energy prices get more expensive, people start using less energy. And I'm not just talking about people being less likely to take a road trip in the United States because it's expensive to fill up their car. There's a lot of products, for example, that are manufactured with slim margins on the basis of cheap energy. And once that energy price goes up, those products are no longer profitable to manufacture, that production shuts down, and that reduces demand on energy, for example. Now, that still has an effect on the global economy, but at the end of the day, that is sort of balanced out in part by the fact that energy prices aren't going as high. And so this, similar to people jumping into supply more, the fact that people will start demanding less, that also has an effect on the upper limit of how high energy prices can actually go. And again, it turns out that it's not as bad as the apocalyptic scenario that we keep hearing about. So what does all of this mean in practical terms? Well, let's look at a specific example. A lot of people have been afraid that with the war in Iran increasing energy prices, that's going to help Russia make a lot more money. It might bail out their economy. It might allow them to continue their war against Ukraine for longer. And that might be true for like a couple of months while global energy production kind of stabilizes, where energy prices are really high and Russia is one of the few suppliers that has a lot of energy available that they can sell to people who need it. But for the long term, again, we realize there's an upper limit. And in Russia's case specifically, it's actually even worse because Russia does not operate under the same market dynamics as every other country on Earth when it comes to oil. Because Russia is sanctioned by most of the major energy buyers on Earth. And so the ones that do purchase from Russia have extreme negotiating leverage over Russia. And they've been using that already to demand really, really low prices from Russia. So when global energy prices go up, Russia as a seller does have a little bit more leverage, and they can demand a little bit of a higher price than maybe they got before. But it's not a one-to-one with the ratio of the increase of global energy prices. Because the people who are buying from Russia at the end of the day, while they have reduced buying power, Russia still has the same reduced selling power. And at the end of the day, Russia still needs to sell to somebody, and they're pretty much the only people who are willing to buy from Russia. And so that means that while the Russian economy will benefit a little bit from increasing global energy prices, it won't be as bad as people think, nor will it be for as long a period of time as people think. And it certainly won't be enough to help Russia survive the war in Ukraine if they otherwise wouldn't. It might just allow them to go a couple of months longer. Now, I hope that all made sense. If you do want to learn more about the global oil trade, which if you watched this long in this video, it's obviously a topic that interests you, I would highly recommend the book The Prize by Daniel Yergin. Again, I will have an affiliate link for that in the description of this video. I'll get a small commission if you do purchase it using that link. You don't have to purchase using my link if that really bothers you. With that being said, if you did enjoy the video though, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. Those things are completely free and they help me out a lot. And if you really enjoy videos like this, breaking down geopolitics in a way that anybody can understand, and you want to support my work, there are a number of ways you can do so in the description of this video as well. Consider becoming a YouTube channel member or a patron. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.